Delta Parish, Louisiana. 1867. The river does not care about emancipation. The Tensas moves the way it has always moved. Slow, brown, indifferent, chewing at its own banks with the patience of something that has never needed a reason to destroy. Spanish moss hangs from the cypress trees in the color of old bandages. The air smells like standing water and iron and something sweet underneath it all. The rotting sweet of sugarcane left too long in the field, which is a smell that every person who has ever been forced to cut it carries in the back of their throat for the rest of their life, whether they want to or not. On a particular Thursday in December of that year, a child is born in a sharecropper's cabin on land that still belongs, technically and practically, to the same family it has always belonged to, because emancipation changed the law and left the geography exactly as it was. The child's mother is named Minerva. The child's father is named Owen. They name the girl Sarah. Nobody writes it down. There is no birth certificate. There is no church record. There is no county ledger with the name Breedlove scratched in ink above a date. Sarah Breedlove, who will one day be Madam C.J. Walker, who will one day be the first self-made female millionaire in the history of the United States of America, who will one day shake the hand of Woodrow Wilson and fund the anti-lynching campaigns of the NAACP, and stand in a 34-room mansion on the Hudson River while her white neighbors write petitions demanding she be removed from the neighborhood, enters this world in complete documentary silence. The archive does not record her arrival. It never thought she would matter. That miscalculation will cost the archive everything. Here is something that the standard biographies of Madam Walker do correctly. They begin with the poverty, the orphanhood at 7, the escape marriage at 14, the widowhood at 20, the laundry. The years and years of other people's laundry, 30 cents a load, knuckles cracked and bleeding in winter, stooped over a washboard in a rented room in St. Louis with a daughter to feed, and nothing. No education, no capital, no patron, no safety net of any kind. Standing between her and the specific, grinding American catastrophe that awaited black women who ran out of options in 1890. They begin with the poverty because the poverty is real and the poverty is important. And the poverty is the engine of the story the culture wants to tell, which is the story of an individual who overcame. But here is what that framing quietly removes from the picture. It removes the question of where the overcomer came from. Not geographically, not biographically. Deeper than that. Further back than that. Back before Owen. Back before Minerva. Back before whatever name the Breedloves carried before they carried Breedlove, which is to say, back before the white family, whose property they were assigned that name like a brand, like a number, like the tick mark in a column of a slave schedule that stands in the archive of Madison Parish, Louisiana, for the entirety of a human life. This investigation is not interested in the story of what Sarah Breedlove overcame. This investigation is interested in the story of what Sarah Breedlove was, in her marrow, in her mitochondria, in the genetic inheritance that traveled the Atlantic in a ship's hold and survived 2 centuries of systematic American erasure and arrived, intact enough to matter, in a sharecropper's cabin on the Tensas River in December of 1867, because the DNA does not forget, even when the archive does. Start with what you can touch. In the reading room of the National Archives Regional Facility in Fort Worth, Texas, which holds the federal census records for Louisiana and Mississippi, there is a specific series of bound volumes that researchers of Black Southern genealogy eventually come to regard with a complicated mixture of reverence and rage. The paper inside these volumes is the color of old teeth. It is fragile in the way that things become fragile when they have been handled by too many hands, looking for too many lost people. The ink has faded in places to the pale brown of river water. In other places, it is still sharp and black and bureaucratic. The handwriting of county clerks who were paid to be thorough and were, in fact, thorough, which is both the reason these records survived and the reason they are, in certain of their pages, almost unbearable to read. The 1870 census is where you find Owen. He is there. He is present. He has a name. He has an age, 35, which is an estimate, the way all ages in these records are estimates for formerly enslaved people, because nobody wrote down the birthday of a slave. He is listed as a farmer. He cannot read. He cannot write. The column for real estate value is blank. The column for personal property value says, in the clerk's neat hand, $50. That is Owen Breedlove's net worth in 1870. $50. The worth of a mule. Less than the worth of a mule, actually, in certain counties, in certain years. Minerva is there beside him. Age 30, estimated. Also cannot read. Also cannot write. Their children, Luvenia and the others. And baby Sarah, 3 years old, listed as female. Black, born Louisiana. They are present. They are counted. They are, for the first time in the history of the United States federal census, people. This is what 1870 looks like. This is what freedom looks like in paper form. A name, an age, a farmer, $50. Now go backward 10 years. The 1860 census of Madison Parish, Louisiana. Federal slave schedule. The enslaver's name is recorded at the top of the column. Below it, a grid. In the grid, numbers, ages, the letters B and M. No names, never names. A 40-year-old black male, a 35-year-old black female, a 17-year-old black female, a 14-year-old black male. Numbers without names, properties without persons, a whole human universe compressed into a ledger of arithmetic. Somewhere in that arithmetic is Owen. Somewhere in that arithmetic is Minerva. We cannot say where exactly. We cannot point to the line and say, there. That is the system working as designed.
By the deep, slow
The slave schedule was engineered precisely to prevent the kind of continuity that genealogists need. It was engineered to make the backward journey impossible, to make the question of origins unanswerable, to make the people who would one day need to know where they came from unable to find out. But here is what the engineers of that system did not account for. They did not account for the blood. The mitochondrial haplogroup is the oldest clock in the human body. It is passed, unchanged, from mother to daughter to daughter to daughter across thousands of years, accumulating mutations so slowly that geneticists can use it to trace lineages back not decades but millennia.
Their sacrifice will not be forgotten.
Past the auction block, past the plantation, past the slave schedule, past every document that the archive used to wall off the past from the people who need it. When genetic genealogy companies and academic researchers began systematically analyzing the DNA profiles of African Americans with deep genealogical roots in the plantation districts of the Louisiana Delta, specifically the long corridor of Madison, Tensas, and Delta parishes, where the Breedlove family was enslaved, a pattern emerged that the researchers describe, in the measured language of peer-reviewed science, as statistically significant clustering. The rest of us can describe it differently. What the DNA shows is a road, not a metaphor. An actual geographic corridor,
Gentlemen, look here now.
traceable across the Atlantic, identifiable by the population genetic signature of the specific haplogroups present in the Louisiana Delta African American population. A road that runs from the sharecropper's cabin on the Tensas River backward through the port of New Orleans, backward through the Caribbean transshipment routes, backward across the Atlantic, and arrives, with the specificity of a pointed finger, on the coast of West Africa, at a place called Ouida, at the edge of a kingdom. And what was waiting there, what had been waiting there for centuries
of biological
before the first European ship appeared on the horizon of the Bight of Benin, is something that no American history textbook, no biography of Madam Walker, no commemorative documentary has ever placed at the center of her story. It is a civilization, not a village, not a tribe, not the generic, featureless Africa that American culture has always used as a placeholder for everything it decided not to learn about. A specific, named, architecturally magnificent, philosophically sophisticated, militarily formidable civilization with a capital city and a royal court and an army. And within that army, a detail so specific, so pointed, so almost impossibly resonant with the life of the woman we are following, that when you encounter it for the first time, you stop reading and you sit with it for a moment before you go on. But we are not there yet. First, we have to follow the road. We have to watch the road disappear into the sea. The port of Ouida sits on a narrow strip of land between a lagoon and the Atlantic Ocean on the coast of what is now the Republic of Benin. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, it was one of the busiest ports in the world. Not for goods, not for spices or timber or textiles, but for people. Between the early 1600s and the formal abolition of the Brazilian trade in 1850, approximately 1 million human beings passed through Ouida in chains, boarded ships in the harbor, and crossed the Atlantic to the plantations of Brazil, Cuba, Saint-Domingue, Martinique, and the American South. 1 million people through a single port. The mathematics of it are incomprehensible at the scale of the individual, which is the only scale that matters. Try to make it individual. Try to hold, just for a moment, a single human being rather than the aggregate.
Forward.
A woman,
Defend.
maybe, mid-20s. She has a name that no record will preserve, because the Portuguese factor at the fort does not record the names of the merchandise. She has a language, Fon, perhaps, or Yoruba, or Iwe. And in that language, she has been calling out to specific deities for specific protections since the moment she understood what was happening to her, which was probably somewhere on the 70-mile road south from the interior. The road that the captives walked in coffins, chained together at the neck, toward the coast. She has never seen the ocean before. The first time she sees it, the Atlantic, gray-green and immense, the horizon vanishing into haze, it is through a door. The door of no return. That is the name the Dahomean people gave to the embarkation point at Ouida, the archway through which the captives passed from the shore onto the longboats that rowed them out to the waiting ships.
I rise to address the assembly.
It is now a monument,
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'd like to raise a point
coast,
regarding the sustainability initiatives discussed
facing the water
earlier.
with the ocean behind it and the
I may
continent
not have
in
been
front.
invited here today,
Its
but the
name is
issues
both
I
literal
represent
and
cannot be
cosmological.
ignored any longer.
In the
Distinguished
Fawn
guests,
worldview,
your chatter
the transition
is irrelevant
through that
compared to the
door was
crisis we
understood
face.
as a passage
Listen
between
closely,
worlds,
because time is
not
running
merely
out.
geographic, but ontological, a crossing from the world of the living into something else, something for which the theology had no fully adequate name. The woman I am describing, the hypothetical ancestor, the genetic great-great-grandmother whose haplogroup signature shows up, centuries later, in the DNA of Black Louisianans from the Delta parishes. walks through that door. She does not come back. She crosses the Atlantic in conditions that the ship logs, when they bother to describe conditions at all, record with the same emotional register as weather reports. Latitude, longitude, deaths, cargo weight. The British and French slave ships operating out of Ouida in the early 19th century packed their human cargo at densities that the ship's surgeons, in their private journals, sometimes described with what reads, with the hindsight of 2 centuries, as muted horror. The hold was 5 feet high. The bodies were arranged in rows. The crossing to the Gulf Coast of Louisiana took approximately 8 weeks under favorable conditions. She arrives at the port of New Orleans. She is sold. She is moved, upriver probably, on a flatboat, through the brown water and the cypress swamp and the hanging moss, to one of the plantation districts of the upper Louisiana parishes. Madison, Tensas, Delta, the cotton and sugar country, where the Breedloves will be enslaved a generation later, where Owen will be born, estimated 1835, where Minerva will be born, estimated 1830.
Watch the swing on that load.
Where, in the fullness of
bring
time,
her around slow.
Sarah will be born. Free. Carrying in her mitochondria a signal, an ancient, unbroken cellular memory of the woman who walked through the door of no return. That no slave schedule, no property ledger, no act of Congress, no century of deliberate cultural erasure could touch. The blood does not negotiate with the archive. The blood simply persists. Now we need to go back further still.
The lineage.
Further than the port of Ouida. Further than the road. Back into the interior. Back into the territory that produced the captive. Back into the kingdom that the Atlantic trade was, in the cruelest possible irony.
Moving along the murals
simultaneously
is like reading a
exploiting
book.
and slowly consuming.
Each dense, extraordinary
Back to
scene
Abomi.
is a chapter.
The name sounds in the mouth like the beginning of a prayer. Ab-o-May. The capital city of the Kingdom of Dahomey, set on a plateau in the West African interior approximately 70 miles north of the coast, surrounded by the flat, red-earthed savanna that the Fawn people had cultivated and administered for more than 2 centuries before the first European soldier ever set foot on it. When the French colonial army finally reached Abomey in November of 1892, at the conclusion of the Second Franco-Dahomean War, they found the city on fire. King Bahanzin, the last independent ruler of Dahomey, a man who had personally led his forces against the French Foreign Legion with a tactical sophistication that French military commanders recorded with reluctant admiration, had ordered the royal palaces burned rather than surrender them intact to the invaders. The French soldiers walked through a city of ash and heat and the smell of destroyed history, and what they found in the ruins, the objects they pulled from the rubble and shipped back to Paris, now occupy an entire wing of the Musée du Quai Branly, where they sit in glass cases and are described on their plaques as Dahomean art. They are not precisely art. They are a government's archive, a civilization's memory. The material record of 2 centuries of Fawn Royal history, encoded not in paper. Paper rots in the humidity of West African savanna, but in bronze, in appliqued textile, in carved wood, in bas-relief clay murals that covered acre after acre of compound wall at Abomi, and told, in images, the complete history of the Dahomean kings, their military campaigns, their alliances, their cosmological relationships with the Vodun deities who governed the kingdom's spiritual life. The French took it. It is a pattern you will recognize. But before the French arrived, before the colonial century that dismantled the African kingdoms one by one with the same systematic efficiency the American census used to erase the names of the enslaved, Dahomey was something that the popular Western imagination has never quite been able to accommodate. because it fits none of the available categories. It was not a primitive society waiting to be civilized. It was not a static, unchanging, traditional community. It was a dynamic, expanding, politically sophisticated state that had been navigating the pressures of the Atlantic trade with the calculated realism of a medieval European power navigating the pressures of its own geopolitics, making alliances, breaking them, expanding its territory through military conquest, managing its relationships with the European trading companies on the coast, with a strategic intelligence that the Europeans found alternately useful and infuriating. And it had something else. Something that the genetic trail from the Louisiana Delta eventually leads us back to. Something that, when you hold it next to the documented life of Madam C.J. Walker, produces a resonance so clean and so specific that it stops being coincidence and starts being something that demands a different word. The Agoji did not ask permission. That is the first thing you need to understand about them. In a kingdom where every social relationship was organized around hierarchy, where the king's authority was absolute, where gender determined the ceiling of every ambition, where the word of a male elder moved through a community like gravity, the Agoji existed as a formally institutionalized exception to every rule that was supposed to contain women. They were the king's elite regiment, all female, celibate during service. Armed with muskets, machetes, and a close-quarters fighting doctrine that French Foreign Legion officers, men who had campaigned across Algeria and Indochina, described in their dispatches as the most ferocious they had encountered anywhere on the African continent. They trained before dawn, every day, without exception. And here is the detail that closes the loop. The detail that brings us back, finally, to the woman in the white gloves behind the wheel of the Model T, to the sharecropper's cabin on the Tensas River, to the laundry and the dream and the factory built on her own ground. The Agoji did not inherit their position. They earned it. Many were recruited from the poor, from the daughters of families with nothing. The regiment was, among its other functions, a formal institutional mechanism by which a woman born with no inheritance, no land, no name worth anything in the social ledger, could promote herself. That phrase, promote herself. Those are Madam Walker's own words, spoken in Chicago in 1912, in a room full of men who expected her to sit down. I promoted myself. She did not know about the Agoji. She could not have. The archive between her and Abomi was too deep, too deliberately destroyed. But the genetic line ran unbroken from that West African plateau to the Louisiana Delta, and something, not mystical, not metaphorical, but cultural, transmitted through the practices and dispositions and ways of moving through the world that enslaved communities preserved underground for generations. Something made it through. It made it through the door of no return. It made it through the hold of the ship. It made it through the slave schedule where Owen and Minerva became tick marks. It made it through the orphanhood and the wash tub and the Mississippi mud. And it stood up in Chicago in 1912, without permission, and spoke. Madam C.J. Walker died on May 25, 1919. She was 51 years old. The cause was hypertensive nephritis. Her kidneys had been destroyed, slowly, by decades of a blood pressure that her doctors could not adequately treat with the medicine available to them, in a country that had spent her entire life trying to crush her. She died in her 34-room mansion on the Hudson River, in a bed that she owned, in a house that she built, on land that she purchased, surrounded by the people she loved. The white neighbors who had petitioned to stop her building never got their wish. She outlasted every single one of their objections. And now, a century after her death, the genetic record gives us something that no biography, no postage stamp, no Netflix documentary has ever given her. A before. Not the cotton field, not the cabin. Before all of that. A civilization on a plateau in West Africa, with bas-relief murals on its palace walls and an all-female army that did not ask permission, and a theology that said the divine lives inside the living, and the living carry their ancestors forward in their blood, and nothing, not the Atlantic, not the archive, not 2 centuries of American erasure, can break that chain. Sarah Breedlove was not born from nothing. She was born from everything. And the river, the Tensas, brown and indifferent, chewing its banks in December 1867, never knew what it was witnessing. But we do. Now we do.